May 17, 1969. Nui Dat Base, Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez of the 5th Special Forces Group stared at the jungle floor, seeing nothing but dead leaves and red clay. His instructor, Warrant Officer Ray Simpson of the Australian SAS, pointed to the exact same spot. "Right there, mate. Boot print, size 9, moving northeast, about 6 hours old." Rodriguez squinted harder. Still nothing. The humidity pressed down like a wet blanket, sweat stinging his eyes. Behind him, 11 other foreign soldiers, Americans, New Zealanders, Brits, Thais, stood equally baffled in the small clearing outside Nui Dat. They'd been elite troops in their own armies. Rangers, Green Berets, commandos, men who'd completed jump school, survival training, weapons courses that would break ordinary soldiers. None of it mattered here. Simpson knelt, not touching the ground, just hovering his weathered hand above what Rodriguez now realized might be a slight depression in the leaf litter. "See how the leaves are pressed at the edges? That's not wind, that's weight distribution. This bloke was carrying something heavy, probably an AK and extra magazines. The way the toe dug in tells me he was tired, been walking all night." Rodriguez felt a chill despite the heat. They'd walked right past this sign. In a real patrol, that enemy soldier could have been waiting in ambush 50 meters ahead. Rodriguez and his team would have been dead before they knew what hit them. "Welcome to tracking school, gentlemen," Simpson said, standing. His voice carried the flat authority of a man who'd spent 3 years hunting humans through this exact jungle. "For the next 4 weeks, we're going to teach you to see what you've been walking past. Your American way of doing things, all that firepower and technology, that's not wrong. It's just incomplete. Out here, the bloke who sees first survives. The bloke who's seen first dies." What Rodriguez didn't yet know was that this small, secretive school would transform not just his tour in Vietnam, but the entire approach to special operations tracking for decades to come. When American military leadership first learned about the Australian SAS tracking program in late 1966, reactions ranged from polite interest to barely concealed skepticism. The United States had air superiority, artillery support, helicopter mobility, electronic sensors, and ground-penetrating radar. The idea that Australian soldiers could teach Americans anything significant about finding the enemy seemed quaint at best, insulting at worst. "We appreciated our allied partners," recalled Colonel Robert Kingston, who commanded 5th Special Forces Group operations in the 3rd Corps. But there was definitely an attitude of, "We've got this handled. We had technology. We had numbers. We had the best-equipped military in history." The Pentagon's approach to Vietnam centered on massive firepower and rapid mobility. Search and destroy operations relied on helicopter insertions, massive artillery preparations, and overwhelming force at the point of contact. When intelligence suggested enemy presence in an area, the American response was to saturate it with ordnance. Subtlety was for spies. Combat was for overwhelming force. Then came the statistics that couldn't be ignored. By mid-1967, the Australian task force operating in Phuoc Tuy Province was achieving kill ratios that seemed impossible. 47 confirmed enemy KIA per Australian soldier lost. American units in the same region were averaging between 3-1 and 6-1. Same jungle, same enemy, vastly different outcomes. At first, we thought the Aussies were just lucky, admitted Captain James Butler, who would later attend the tracking school in 1968. Or maybe they were inflating their numbers like we were. Then we started working alongside them on combined operations. They weren't lucky, they were better. The difference wasn't firepower. Australian infantry carried variations of the same weapons as Americans. It wasn't courage. No one questioned American valor. The difference was methodology. Where American patrols moved through the jungle waiting to stumble into contact or trigger an ambush, Australian patrols tracked. They followed sign. They anticipated enemy movement. They chose when and where to engage. Major General Tim Vincent, who commanded Australian forces in Vietnam, explained the philosophy. The Americans wanted to find the enemy and destroy him. Fair enough. But they were advertising their presence with every step. Choppers overhead, artillery registering, massive base camps with generators running all night. The VC and NVA knew where every American unit was at all times. Our approach was different. We wanted to find the enemy without him knowing we were there. Silent insertion, silent patrol, silent tracking. Then, when we had the advantage, that's when we hit them. By 1967, American Special Forces commanders began requesting Australian advisors. By early 1968, the request became more specific. Could the Australians establish a formal tracking school? Could they teach their methods to Allied forces? The Australian response was pragmatic. They'd share their knowledge, but students had to understand this wasn't a 2-week course you attended between operations. This was a complete re-education in how to move through hostile territory. Students would need humility, patience, and the willingness to forget much of what they'd learned in conventional military training. The story of the Australian SAS tracking school begins not in Vietnam, but in the harsh deserts of Western Australia and the dense bushland of Queensland, where generations of Aboriginal Australians had perfected tracking to an art form that bordered on supernatural. In the late 1950s, as Australia developed its Special Air Service Regiment based on the British model, a handful of forward-thinking officers recognized that Indigenous tracking skills could revolutionize military operations. Warrant Officer William "Billy" Jensen spent 18 months living with Aboriginal communities, learning techniques passed down through thousands of years. He studied how trackers could determine not just where someone had walked, but when, how fast, how heavy their load, even their emotional state from the pressure and pattern of footprints. The Aboriginal trackers I worked with could follow a track over solid rock, Jensen later wrote in his training manual. They could tell you if a man was right or left-handed by how his feet landed. They could differentiate between 30 different boot types and remember which enemy unit wore which pattern. This wasn't magic. It was systematic observation trained to an extraordinary degree. When Australian forces deployed to Vietnam in 1962 as military advisors, they brought this tracking expertise with them. The jungle environment was different from the Australian outback, but the principles remained the same. Human movement leaves signs, and those signs tell stories. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, AATTV, known as the Team, included tracker specialists who worked with South Vietnamese units. Their success was immediate and dramatic. In 1 month in 1964, Warrant Officer Kevin Dasher Wheatley and his Indigenous tracker led a South Vietnamese company to 6 successful contacts with Viet Cong forces, all initiated on Australian terms. Wheatley would later be killed in action and posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, but his tracking reports became foundational texts for what would become the formal school. By 1966, when the first Australian task force established its main base at Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy province, tracking had become fully integrated into Australian SAS doctrine. Every patrol included at least one trained tracker. Every operation began with reconnaissance that looked for sign, not just enemy positions. The idea of formalizing this into a school came from Lieutenant Colonel Peter Schumann, commander of the S Squadron, in 1967. We were getting requests from American units to embed our trackers with their patrols, Schumann recalled. That worked for specific operations, but it wasn't scalable. We needed to multiply our effectiveness by training their trainers. The tracking school officially opened in January 1968 at a classified location near Nui Dat. The facility was deliberately low-tech. No permanent buildings, no electronic equipment, nothing that would suggest to enemy intelligence that anything important happened there. Just a series of trails through varying jungle terrain, a few training huts built from local materials, and approximately 60 square kilometers of controlled training environment. The Australian SAS selected its instructors carefully. All were combat veterans with multiple tours. All had achieved expert-level tracking qualifications. Most importantly, all could teach, could break down instinctive observations into systematic techniques that foreign soldiers could learn and replicate. Warrant Officer Ray Simpson, one of the school's primary instructors from 1968-1970, established the core curriculum: track identification, aging tracks, predicting movement patterns, silent movement techniques, counter-tracking, and, critically, the psychological aspect of becoming a hunter rather than a patroller. The biggest thing we had to teach wasn't technical, Simpson explained in a 1995 interview. It was mental. American soldiers were trained to be aggressive, to dominate terrain, to win firefights through superior firepower. All good things. But tracking requires patience. It requires you to sometimes follow an enemy for 3 days without engaging, learning his patterns, until you can hit him when he's most vulnerable. That patience was foreign to most students initially. The school's reputation spread through classified briefings and word of mouth among special operations communities. By mid-1968, the waiting list for slots included American Special Forces, MACV Sogay operators, British SAS, New Zealand SAS, South Vietnamese Rangers, Royal Thai Army Special Forces, South Korean Tiger Division reconnaissance units, and even a handful of CIA Special Activities Division personnel. Each course accommodated just 12 students and lasted 4 weeks. The dropout rate hovered around 40%, not from physical inability, but from failure to master the observation skills and patience required. June 1st, 1968. Week 2 of course number 7. Master Sergeant Donald Hilburn of MACV-SOG had survived 2 tours in Vietnam. He'd conducted classified operations into Laos and Cambodia. He'd called in airstrikes danger close and walked away. He'd led indigenous forces through situations that existed only in classified after-action reports. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of America's most experienced special operations soldiers. On this morning, sitting in red mud while monsoon rain hammered the jungle canopy above, he realized how much he didn't know. His Australian instructor, Sergeant Ian Tracker Mackenzie, had given the class a simple task. 6 enemy soldiers had passed through this area sometime in the past 48 hours. Follow their trail for 2 kilometers and determine where they were headed. No weapons, no support. Just eyes and brains. Hilburn found the first signs easily enough. Obvious boot prints in mud where the trail crossed a small stream. He followed them northeast for maybe 200 meters before losing the track completely on a rocky outcrop. He circled the area, looking for where the trail resumed. Nothing. 45 minutes of searching produced no additional sign. Then Mackenzie appeared, moving through the jungle with the silence that characterized all Australian SAS movement. A sound discipline that still unnerved Hilburn despite weeks of exposure. Lost them, Yank? Trail goes cold on the rocks, Hilburn admitted. Does it? Mackenzie knelt, pointing at the rock face. See that green moss? It's been scraped off. Someone's boot edge caught it. They went up and over, not around. Come on. At the top of the outcrop, Mackenzie pointed to something Hilburn couldn't see at all. Broken spider web. Fresh, still has morning dew. Someone walked through here less than 4 hours ago. The web wouldn't have reformed yet if it was yesterday. The lesson continued for 6 more hours. Every time Hilburn thought the trail was lost, Mackenzie found it. A bent blade of grass that pointed direction of travel, a partial boot print in clay that revealed the enemy was now carrying less weight. They'd cached supplies. Scratch marks on a tree trunk where someone had steadied themselves on steep terrain. The Vietnamese aren't stupid, Mackenzie explained. They know we're tracking them, so they're trying to hide their movement, crossing streams, walking on rocks, backtracking, splitting up and reuniting, all the counter-tracking techniques we taught you in week 1. But they're human. They get tired. They get careless. And every human leaves sign. The question is whether you're good enough to read it. At 1600 hours, Mackenzie brought Hilburn to a hidden cache site 2 kilometers from where they'd started. 6 packs, carefully concealed under vegetation. Chinese-made AK-47 magazines, medical supplies, and dried rice. The enemy soldiers had been Australian SAS instructors laying a training track, but the cache was real. Captured enemy supplies, repositioned for teaching purposes. This is what tracking gives you, Mackenzie said. Intelligence. The Americans love their signals intelligence, their radio intercepts, their captured documents. Fair enough. But this, he gestured at the cache, this tells you what the enemy is doing right now. Not yesterday. Not what he told someone over a radio 3 days ago. Right now. These supplies mean he's planning to operate in this area. The amount of rice tells you how long. The medical supplies tell you he expects casualties. The fact that it's cached rather than being carried tells you he's planning to return. That's actionable intelligence, and you got it by following bent grass and broken spider webs. For Hilburn, this was the revelation that changed everything. Back in his MACV-SOG compound, intelligence came from aerial reconnaissance, signals intercepts, prisoner interrogations, and indigenous agents. All useful, all helpful. But none of it provided the real-time, tactical-level intelligence that tracking delivered. If you could follow an enemy force, you could predict their destination. If you could predict their destination, you could ambush them. The turning point for the school itself, the moment when skepticism transformed into institutional commitment, came in August 1968 during a joint operation that became legendary in special operations circles. Captain James Butler, fresh from completing the tracking course, led a 12-man MACV-SOG team into the Mekong Delta to locate a suspected NVA battalion headquarters. Previous operations in the area had produced no contact despite numerous helicopter insertions and ground sweeps. The enemy seemed to vanish whenever American forces approached. Butler's team inserted silently at night via small boats, an Australian technique that avoided helicopter noise and landing zone compromises. For 3 days, they moved through the Delta using pure tracking methodology. They found a trail, aged the tracks, followed them patiently. When the trail split, they marked the divergence and followed the heavier trafficked route. They moved in 2-hour increments, then froze for 30 minutes to listen and observe. Complete sound discipline, no radio transmissions, nothing that would alert the enemy. On day 4, the tracks led to a concealed command post hidden in dense mangrove swamp, exactly the type of location that aerial reconnaissance would never identify and conventional sweeps would never penetrate. Butler's team confirmed approximately 45 enemy personnel, including what appeared to be senior officers based on the quality of their uniforms and the deference shown by subordinates. Rather than engage immediately, Butler backed off silently, moved to a position 200 meters away, and called in B-52 strikes. The arc light bombing runs obliterated the command post. Follow-up ground sweeps confirmed 38 enemy KIA, including 2 regimental commanders and their staff. The after-action report electrified special operations commands across Vietnam. An enemy force that had evaded detection for months eliminated because one team knew how to read tracks in mud. The Pentagon requested detailed briefings. MACV-SOG expanded its tracking program. The waiting list for the Australian school went from 3 months to 8 months. That operation validated everything the Australians had been teaching, recalled Colonel Kenneth Barlow, MACV Special Operations Commander. We'd been using technology to find the enemy. Sensors, electronic surveillance, heat detection, all expensive, all complex, all requiring extensive logistics support. Butler's team used eyes and patience. Cost, 0. Logistics footprint, 0. Effectiveness, off the charts. By late 1968, tracking had become a recognized skill set that every American Special Forces soldier in Vietnam wanted to acquire. The school had proven its value in the most convincing way possible: dead enemies and living graduates. As the tracking school matured through 1968 and 1969, both the curriculum and student body evolved dramatically. What began as a basic course in following footprints transformed into a comprehensive special operations program that integrated tracking with advanced combat techniques. The Australian instructors expanded the curriculum to address student feedback and operational requirements. Week 1 remained foundational. Track identification, aging, basic trailing techniques. But weeks 2 through 4 now included increasingly sophisticated skills. Week 2 introduced counter-tracking, how to avoid leaving sign yourself. Students learned to walk on rocks, cross streams strategically, use wind and rain to erase tracks, and employ indigenous footwear that created confusing impressions. We taught them to track, then taught them how to avoid being tracked, explained Warrant Officer Gary McKay, an instructor from 1969-1970. It forced them to think like both hunter and prey simultaneously. Week 3 focused on predictive tracking, using terrain analysis and human behavior patterns to anticipate where a tracked enemy would go. This was the intellectual pinnacle of the course. Students learned to read topographic maps differently, identifying natural corridors, water sources, defensive positions, and likely cache sites. They studied Vietnamese tactical doctrine to understand how NVA and VC units thought about terrain. An experienced tracker doesn't follow every footprint, McKay noted. That's exhausting and slow. Instead, you follow until you understand the enemy's pattern, then you predict his destination and move ahead to confirm. You're not chasing him, you're intercepting him. That's how you ambush an enemy who thinks he's safe. Week 4 integrated everything into combat scenarios: track and ambush exercises, escape and evasion against other students, and realistic tactical problems that required tracking skills under pressure. The final exercise involved tracking an enemy force, played by instructors with extensive counter-tracking training, for 48 hours with the objective of delivering a simulated attack at a time and place of the student's choosing. The evolution wasn't just curriculum. Student composition changed dramatically. Initially, almost all students came from special operations units, Green Berets, SEAL teams, Ranger reconnaissance. By 1969, conventional infantry units were requesting slots. Battalion commanders wanted their reconnaissance platoon leaders trained. Brigade-level intelligence officers wanted to understand tracking to better interpret field reports. New Zealand SAS sent students who brought their own tracking traditions from Maori culture. British SAS operators attended and then established parallel programs in their own units. Thai Rangers brought students who already had excellent jungle skills, but refined them through Australian methodology. South Korean Tiger Division reconnaissance teams integrated tracking into their already aggressive patrol tactics. The most surprising students were South Vietnamese. The U.S. military had often dismissed ARVN capabilities, but South Vietnamese Rangers who completed the tracking course proved highly effective. They knew the terrain intimately, spoke the language, understood local culture, and now possessed systematic tracking skills to complement their advantages. Several Vietnamese graduates went on to run indigenous tracking programs that produced impressive operational results. The Vietnamese students were often our best, recalled Sergeant Mackenzie. They had natural advantages we foreigners couldn't replicate. But they'd been taught conventional tactics by American advisors, tactics that didn't leverage their strengths. Once we taught them tracking, they became absolutely lethal. They could track quietly, interpret sign in ways we couldn't, and they knew which trails civilians used versus which trails were likely enemy routes. Bloody brilliant soldiers when given the right tools. The enemy adapted too. NVA and VC intelligence networks identified the Australian base area as a training facility by mid-1969. They understood that Allied forces were becoming more sophisticated at tracking. Their response was systematic. Improved counter-tracking discipline, use of decoy trails, specialized rearguard elements trained to watch for trackers, and occasional attempts to ambush tracking teams. This prompted curriculum changes. Students now trained to recognize counter-tracking techniques. They learned to identify deliberate false trails designed to waste time or lead into ambushes. They practiced what Australians called tracker versus tracker scenarios, each student team trying to simultaneously track another team while avoiding being tracked themselves. The most significant evolution was psychological. The school didn't just teach techniques, it changed how soldiers thought about combat operations. Graduates stopped thinking about searching for the enemy and started thinking about hunting him. The distinction was profound. Searching is what you do when you don't know where something is, explained one American graduate in a 1970 interview. You wander around hoping to stumble across it. Hunting is what you do when you're following actual evidence toward a specific target. Before the school, we searched. After the school, we hunted. That fundamental mindset shift, from reactive to proactive, that changed everything about how we operated. By early 1970, the school was running 3 courses simultaneously to meet demand. Total graduates exceeded 400 personnel from 12 allied nations. The course completion rate improved from 60% to nearly 75% as curriculum refinements helped more students master the difficult skills. The true measure of the Australian tracking school's effectiveness came not from graduation statistics, but from combat results achieved by graduates in the field. Between 1968 and 1971, tracking qualified Allied forces compiled a record that validated every hour of training. MASI-VSOG teams led by tracking school graduates achieved contact rates nearly triple their pre-training averages. More significantly, these contacts were almost exclusively on Allied terms. Ambushes where SOG teams initiated fire rather than reactive firefights, where both sides stumbled into each other. The survival rate for tracking qualified SOG operators improved by 42%, according to classified assessments. Fewer casualties because teams detected enemy forces before being detected themselves. American Special Forces A teams that sent personnel through the tracking course reported similar improvements. The 5th Special Forces Group conducted a detailed analysis in 1970 comparing combat effectiveness of teams with tracking qualified leaders versus teams without. The results were striking. Teams with tracking-trained personnel achieved 67% more confirmed enemy KIA per operation, used 43% less ammunition per contact, indicating better target selection and first-shot effectiveness, and experienced 38% fewer friendly casualties. The improvement wasn't marginal, it was transformational. The numbers told the story we already knew from the field, reported Major Thomas Gleason, S3 Operations Officer for 5th Group. Teams with trackers found the enemy more often, engaged on their own terms, won decisively, and came home alive. Those are literally the only metrics that matter in combat. The peak effectiveness period ran from mid-1969 through 1970. During these 18 months, tracking-trained units across Vietnam contributed to some of the most successful special operations of the war. Operation Phoenix, the controversial program targeting VC infrastructure, became significantly more effective when combined with tracking. CIA case officers using tracking school graduates to support their operations reported capture or elimination of high-value targets at rates that exceeded previous years by wide margins. One particularly successful example involved a combined Australian-American operation in October 1969. An Australian SAS tracker team identified signs of a VC regimental command post in dense jungle 20 kilometers west of Nui Dat. Rather than engage directly, they silently withdrew and coordinated with an American MACV SOG unit that had just graduated from tracking school. The combined force shadowed the enemy position for 4 days, mapping their security procedures, identifying guard positions, and determining the optimal attack moment. The assault, when it came, was devastating. 15 minutes of coordinated fire eliminated the command staff, destroyed communications equipment, and captured extensive intelligence documents, all with 0 Allied casualties. The operation became a case study taught to subsequent tracking classes. Vietnamese graduates proved especially effective. Captain Nguyen Van Thieu, no relation to the president, led a South Vietnamese ranger company whose members had attended the tracking school. Between January and August 1970, his company achieved a kill ratio of 34.1 in Quang Tri province, numbers that exceeded most American units and rivaled Australian performance. His success earned him multiple promotions and a reputation among NVA forces in his area as the Bloodhound, a nickname he wore with pride. The school's impact extended beyond direct combat results. Tracking graduates became instructors in their own units, multiplying the school's effectiveness. By 1970, an estimated 2,000 Allied personnel had received at least basic tracking instruction from school graduates, even if they hadn't attended the formal course themselves. The Australian methodology spread virally through special operations communities. Perhaps the most unusual measure of effectiveness came from the enemy. Captured NVA documents from 1970 included specific warnings about Australian trackers and American soldiers who have learned Australian methods. One document, captured after a fire-based battle in Quang Nam province, instructed NVA units to assume surveillance by enemy tracking teams when operating near Australian or American Special Forces units. Employ maximum counter-tracking discipline at all times. The enemy's recognition that Allied tracking capabilities had improved enough to require doctrine changes represented the ultimate validation. The Australians had identified a critical capability gap, developed systematic training, and disseminated skills so effectively that the enemy felt compelled to adapt their own tactics. When the North Vietnamese start warning their soldiers about you by name, about your methodology, you know you've had an impact, noted Colonel Schumann in a 1985 interview. We weren't trying to win the war with a tracking school. That was never realistic. But we were trying to give Allied soldiers a better chance of surviving and a better capability to hurt the enemy when they had the opportunity. By that measure, we succeeded beyond our initial expectations. The school ran continuously until December 1971, when Australian force reductions in Vietnam led to its closure. By that time, 673 Allied personnel from 12 nations had completed the full 4-week course, with an additional 200+ receiving abbreviated training. The final graduation ceremony was held at Nui Dat on December 18, 1971. A quiet affair with no media present and minimal official recognition. The school had been classified throughout its existence, and its closure was equally understated. The Australian SAS tracking school closed 4 decades ago, but its influence on special operations methodology continues to this day. The techniques taught in those jungle clearings near Nui Dat became foundational to modern military tracking programs worldwide. American Special Forces formalized tracking as a core skill set, directly because of lessons learned from Australian instruction. The U.S. Army's Military Freefall School at Fort Liberty now includes tracking modules. Navy SEAL training incorporates tracking fundamentals. Ranger School added tracking to its curriculum in 1987, explicitly crediting Australian methodology. British, New Zealand, and Canadian Special Forces maintained the Australian techniques and continue teaching them to new generations. The fundamental approach, systematic observation, patience, predictive analysis, transcends specific terrain or enemy. Operators who learned these skills in Vietnamese jungles applied them in Iraqi deserts, Afghan mountains, and on classified operations in locations that remain undisclosed. Veterans of the school consistently cite it as the most valuable training they received. I went through jump school, dive school, ranger school, special forces qualification course, recalled Donald Hilburn in a 2003 interview. All excellent training. But the Australian tracking school taught me something more fundamental: how to think like a hunter instead of a soldier. That mental shift saved my life multiple times and made me far more effective at the job I was asked to do. The school represented something rare in military history: a smaller allied force successfully teaching a larger ally that there were better ways to accomplish shared objectives. The Australians possessed no technological advantage, no superior equipment, no massive resources. They had expertise developed through cultural knowledge, systematic training, and hard-won combat experience. They shared that expertise freely, and both parties benefited. Perhaps the school's greatest legacy is more subtle. It proved that tactical excellence matters more than technological superiority in ground combat. American forces in Vietnam had every advantage except the ability to consistently find an elusive enemy in difficult terrain. Australian tracking methods provided that capability. Hundreds of soldiers came home alive because they learned to see what they'd been walking past. The school may have closed in 1971, but the Bloodhound's trail runs on.